Hello everyone, and welcome to our Paleo and Neolithic review. So we're going to go through the questions for the reflection activities that we had for this week. And I'll kind of give you what some of the class's answers were, what some of my perspective was, and you can kind of see where your answers were in relation to that, as well as providing some additional information and context to some of these questions. So question number one, 5 things. What are the 5 most important ways that life changed during the Neolithic era? Make sure to explain why you selected these changes and why you feel they were the most important. And I thought overall the class did a really good job of depicting numerous ways that life changed for people around the world during this very important time period. And the first and probably the most important is the concept of sedentary life, right? The fact that people were going from hunting and gathering groups constantly on the move to more sedentary, permanent locations. And that in a lot of ways, it's kind of a question of the chicken or the egg. What came first, right? Sedentary life or agriculture? Did agriculture lead to people being able to get larger populations and staying in one place, or does sedentary life lead to agriculture? And it looks like the more we're looking back at this, the more it seems like actually sedentary life came slightly before the development of agriculture, particularly because there was that increase in global temperatures in response to the end of the last ice age that created a lot more warmer, wetter temperatures around the globe, which allowed for numerous and abundant crops to naturally grow, which meant that herds got much larger and could also stay in one location for longer periods of time. And people started following suit, started settling and living in one location for a sustained amount of time. And during that time, they began engaging in what's known as incipient cultivation, pretty much not relying on the practices of planting crops to sustain your population, but just kind of dabbling in it. Maybe they didn't want to walk quite so far away from their village, so they took some and transplanted some crops closer. Maybe they started breeding those plants and the seeds and creating hybrid plants that would produce more grains or more produce. Same thing with the domestication of animals. Perhaps they built some pens, caught some young animals and raised them up from a young age and started doing this for multiple generations. Essentially, they weren't necessarily needing to survive off of the skills of agriculture, but they were kind of developing them at the same time, thanks in large part to the sedentary lifestyle. Once then the global temperatures start cooling again after that 2,000 or so year period, that's really when the agricultural revolution starts, because those communities that had achieved a larger population size than your typical hunting and gathering group wanted to keep those numbers. They were pretty much left with the only choice of starting to rely upon those kind of incipient cultivation techniques that they had learned throughout the years, and that's where you see the transition to agriculture. Now that the larger populations were there, agriculture needed to be used to support them. So throughout plenty of places in the world, lots of populations went back to just regular hunting and gathering lifestyles, but there were enough locations here and there that have started to adopt agriculture, and it started to more or less spread from there. So certainly agriculture and sedentary life, kind of the 2 most important ways that life starts to change here. And from those, you start seeing a cascading effect of sort of cause and effect that leads to a lot of the other really important changes during this time period. For example, now that people are no longer moving, now that they have stable, permanent villages, they can start having more storage. They can store food if they have a really good harvest and keep it for a year that they might not have a lot of harvest. This also leads to the idea of surplus. People can start actually owning things, more than what you can just carry on your back. They can have individual residence. The entire idea of kind of private property starts to develop during this time period. Because of that surplus, then that leads to more differentiation in labor, right? Not everyone is needing to pitch in for procuring food, so it gives more people time to do things like create pottery, become really good at shaping stone tools or developing new tools or new technologies that make agriculture easier or better. Spend more time domesticating animals, interbreeding species, or different types of same species, dogs or cattle or whatever, to make them more suitable for human use. All of this kind of differentiation of labor also is directly linked to the idea of sedentary life and storage. Of course, once you're in one location for a set amount of time, these people start getting a more kind of detailed idea of their kind of natural surroundings and begin utilizing them in more intensive ways than what they would have had a chance to do as hunters and gatherers. For example, they can start looking at the different rock formations around them and perhaps starting to mine, rocks that are really unique or special. For example, obsidian with Hayuk. Another example might be they might have a lot of really good timber resources that they can start taking advantage of to build larger, stronger buildings. And also, what this ends up leading to is an increase in trade. Of course, there certainly was trade with hunters and gatherer groups, but when you're constantly on the move, it becomes a lot more difficult to, regularly interact with those other groups that you might be coming in contact with. Whereas now, if you have a sedentary, permanent city or village that you are living in, it means you can be found in the same place year after year. People always know where to find you. You always know where to find them. And once more, you can take advantage of what your geographical region does really well and then exchange that with someone else and take advantage of what is close by to their village and what their village does really well. So maybe one village has really good clay for making pottery. Another village has really good stone for making stone tools. You can get an exchange going, so you start mutually becoming beneficial. That very much is a very important part of this. Of course, another impact of that idea of surplus differentiation of labor, and we'll be talking about this more in one of the future questions. There's an increase in social stratification, right? Societies generally become less egalitarian, so to speak. Some of this is just a natural function of, with more people, there tends to be a increased drive towards some sort of hierarchy as far as just kind of organizing everyone. If you want to build a really big wall around your town for defenses, it's going to take a certain amount of organization and planning to make that happen. And also, that's part of it. The other part of it is also the fact that fewer or more people can kind of work producing food, so that a few people don't essentially have to work at all to produce food. And we'll talk, like I said, a little bit more about this process in the future, but a lot of people also pointed that out as I think is a very important way that life changed for people during this time period, an increase in the way society is becoming structured. Of course, a lot of people also pointed to the numerous technologies that are related to agriculture. The idea of pottery, of metallurgy, of the potter's wheel, of textiles. Essentially, once more, it's sort of a cause and effect, where now that people are surviving in a new and different manner, they are essentially developing technologies and improvements to help what they are doing and make it easier and more efficient and more effective for themselves. So those were some of the main things that I saw in the answers and that I'd like to kind of reinforce here for question number 1. All right, so question number 2. List some of the advantages and disadvantages of agriculture. Why do you think that the practice became so widely adopted? Then think about your own daily life. How much of the way you live is thanks to the Neolithic Revolution? Once more, a lot of people did a really good job listing some of the various advantages and disadvantages. Of course, agriculture leads to higher populations. Also, of course, that's kind of tied in with the idea of a sedentary lifestyle that also leads to higher birth rates. It's a lot healthier oftentimes for women when they are pregnant to not have to be moving around a whole lot very close to the time period they are giving birth. Greater food yields. Of course, the entire idea of storage and surplus becomes very, very appealing to people. Also, the idea of greater protection. When you're living in greater numbers, you can protect yourself more easily from animals and other people. And of course, the idea of the specialization of labor and kind of that cascading effect we talked about in question number 1. All of those I think you can really see as being advantages linked to agriculture. So, what are some of the disadvantages? Well, it turns out that agriculture is a lot more susceptible to natural disasters than hunting and gathering is. If there's a severe drought, or if a hurricane comes through, or a flood, most hunting and gathering groups can just get up, leave, find another herd to follow, find another location that is better off. Whereas when you're tied to one location, a flood comes through and ruins all your crops. If that's what you were depending upon feeding your family for the next year, you can be in real trouble. Um, Also, this is kind of counterintuitive, but actually agriculture seems to take more work and more effort than hunting and gathering does. Studies show that most hunting and gathering groups work somewhere between 20 to 25 hours a week procuring food for themselves, and the rest of the time they're able to spend with leisure activities, with social activities, religious activities, whatever else they would like to do. Whereas agriculture, you're getting a lot higher degree of individuals having to work 40, 50, 60, 70 hours a week in order to produce enough food for themselves. And increasingly, what ends up happening with the idea of social stratification is a certain percentage of the population are expected to produce the food and the goods for the rest of the population. So there's a certain percentage who do not have to work in order to produce food for themselves. And that kind of leads into that idea of greater social stratification essentially being a disadvantage as well. There's certainly a lot of people who end up not necessarily being well served by this shift or this transition as societies become more stratified and inequality increases. Very good for the people who are on top, not so good for the people who are on bottom, especially when you have elements such as slavery becoming more and more widespread in a lot of these sedentary agricultural populations, because a lot of times agricultural work is really hard, really unpleasant, and people really want to find ways to just not have to do it, but still reap the advantages and the benefits from it. A couple more disadvantages that come along with agriculture. A lot of the grains and the early agricultural means that people were using were not as healthy as a hunting and gathering diet were. So you see people having worse teeth off. You see them having smaller bone sizes, less healthier bones. They're not getting as much nutrition as traditional hunters and gatherers did. So people in general actually become less healthy in the transition to agriculture. Now, throughout time, that of course balances out as people are able to get more kind of balanced diets and so forth, but that really doesn't happen in a lot of cases until you're talking about the early modern or sometimes even the modern world. And a lot of agricultural populations throughout history much less healthy than their hunting and gathering forebears. And the final piece I would like to talk about is the aspect of agricultural societies being less healthy in connection to domestication of animals, because a lot of the most virulent diseases that we have that still impact our society come from agriculture and come from the animals associated with that. So think about chicken pox, for example. Think about smallpox. Think about measles. These were all diseases that had once been in animal populations and were then transported to human populations. So the end result is that a lot of times agricultural societies are less healthy than hunting and gathering societies. So as you can see, there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages that go along with agriculture, and it's not quite as simplistic as agriculture was this wonderful, fantastic thing that all agricultural societies and people were always better off than hunters and gatherers. That's really not the case. But because there were these advantages and disadvantages, I think it's interesting to think about why did it become so widely adopted. A lot of you came up with some really good ideas for this. A lot of it focused around kind of naming or simply stating that kind of the advantages outweighed the disadvantages to a certain degree. And on a certain level, I think that take and premise is correct. I would also say that a lot of the advantages of agriculture you can see pretty quickly. I mean, you can notice an increase in population size. You can notice that you have more surplus you can take advantage of. You notice that it's kind of an easier, or it can sometimes be kind of an easier existence, not have to be moving from place to place as often. That a lot of times those are a little already apparent, whereas the disadvantages you might not necessarily recognize. For example, you might not recognize how susceptible you are to natural disaster until one actually hits, which might be a couple hundred years in some cases, depending on the location that you're talking about. You might not necessarily realize the shift in labor, particularly in if it takes multiple generations for a hierarchy to form, so that perhaps within one generation you might not notice as huge of a difference, but when it gets to three generations down the line and now you are kind of reserved to a farming class that has to spend 90% of their time working the land, that is going to be a dramatic shift from what their ancestors had potentially been doing. And of course, the dental problems, the health problems, susceptibility to diseases, those are things that the people were talking about didn't really have a great idea of, didn't really have a concept of. So they wouldn't recognize that they are less healthy because they are living in closer proximity to animals. So that a lot of the disadvantages, while we recognize them now, would not have been readily apparent to people at this time period. Finally, I think the most important reason is that once a group of people decides to shift towards agriculture, the population size do rise, and that in order to maintain those populations, you have to stick with agriculture. You can't just go back to hunting and gathering on a whim. It's kind of like joining the mafia. Once you're in for life. You can't get out, right? That's how agriculture is. Once you start achieving these higher population levels, the only way to keep that going is going to be finding ways to make agriculture work. So once you are in, you get locked in. It's like you're signing a contract with a cable company or something like that. It's much more difficult to get out than with hunting and gathering, which is a lot more fluid. So I think those are some of the reasons why you see agriculture throughout time becoming kind of the predominant way that people sustain themselves around the world. As far as how much of our own daily lives are thanks to the Neolithic Revolution, most people came up with this answer: pretty much all of it. It's really hard to imagine anything in our life today that is not in some way, shape, or form linked to the development of agriculture. So much of our lifestyle that we are used to living is dependent upon this. Except for the very few small percentage of the world's population that are still reliant on hunting and gathering, which there are still some populations out there, but it is a decreasing number and a vast minority. Pretty much everything we do in our daily lives is really linked to this idea of agriculture and everything that stemmed from it. All right, so I think this was a fun question. Given the choice, would you rather live in a Paleolithic small hunting and gathering band, a small early cultural village such as Catalhoyuk, or an emerging large city such as Eridu? Make sure to explain your answers. And there's really a split within the class as far as which of these different areas or time periods or lifestyles that they would feel more comfortable living. Some people cited the kind of close community, the relative equality, the better diet of hunters and gatherers, and said that that would be the lifestyle that they would choose to live in. Some people cited the kind of increased opportunities for specialization, the sedentary lifestyle, the increase in trade of a small village, and some people like the idea of kind of increasing technology, a more in-depth social order, increased protection of large cities such as Eridu. So, and a lot of it, when people explain their answers, kind of came down to the kind of lifestyle that they're used to living now, and how that sort of impacted what they felt they would be most comfortable with at this time period, which I thought was pretty interesting. So everyone did a really good job on question number 3. All right, moving on to question number 4. Why was there more social equality in small groups of hunters and gatherers who are constantly moving than in later societies who live in towns and cities? And why do you think the development of agriculture and sedentary life led to more inequality? So really this gets back to our idea of that we were talking about earlier as far as hunting and gathering groups. A lot of times with a group that is that small, there's a kind of a stronger sense of community. I mean, in a group of 30 to 50 people, you know everyone who you're going to be interacting with in your daily life. There's not that anonymity that comes with living in a larger social setting or population. There's also a stronger link, I'd say, to like shared survival because you recognize how important everyone in the group is, and everyone in the group essentially has to pitch in if everyone is going to survive. So I think those are a couple of good starting points. But there's a few things that are very difficult or almost impossible in hunting and gathering groups that we see form sort of the fundamental bedrock of social hierarchies in the future. The first is the separation of labor. Pretty much everyone in a hunting and gathering group is doing the same kind of tasks. Now, someone might be better at making stone tools, someone might be better at hunting, someone might be better at tracking animals and tracking game, and of course they would be fulfilling those functions. But the point is that everyone would be doing relatively the same thing, and really, hunting and gathering groups are the closest that we really ever come to an idea of a meritocracy, where those people who are better at certain tasks are going to be able to get to do them more. They are going to be rewarded for those, but it's not something they're going to just arbitrarily be able to pass on to their children, to future generations. They're not going to become entrenched throughout time. And perhaps the most important idea of why hunting and gathering groups had higher levels of social equality than later groups was the idea that there's really no concept of wealth in hunting and gathering societies. When you're restricted pretty much to what you can carry on your back, it makes it almost impossible to develop this kind of concept. I mean, sure, you might have a few more beads than someone else. You might have a few more cool tools or rocks or something like that, a few more skins, but it's not going to be to the level where you can once more perpetuate that wealth throughout the various generations and form different levels within society. That once you get that idea of surplus and more private kind of land ownership and so forth, that it's much easier to develop those ideas of inequality and some people being on the top, some people being in the middle, some people being on the bottom trying to support the whole structure. It's very difficult to do that without an idea of a separation of labor, without people fulfilling different tasks within society, and without a concept of wealth, of some people fundamentally having more, and most importantly, being able to pass those down from one generation to another, because most of the classes that we are going to see, they don't just happen overnight. They're going to form over a sustained period of time where people with more resources, more access to resources, pass that down from one generation to another, making it hereditary and making it entrenched within the social and political orders. All right, and last but not least, number 5, then and now, look at the various artistic depictions from this week's material, such as the cave paintings and the Venus figurines. What role did art seem to play in the lives of these early cultures, and in what ways do you think their art is similar to the kinds that we enjoy today, and how might it be different? Once more, a lot of people have some really good ideas on looking at the various kinds of art throughout the chapter, the PowerPoints and the videos that we saw for this week. A lot of people brought up the idea of it having seeming kind of a more functional purpose within the ancient world. That not just were the cave paintings there for artistic purposes, but they could have also been hunting guides or served a ritual purpose. A lot of people kind of point out to the idea that a lot of times these were aspirational. People were looking at what outcomes did they want to see happen. Do they want to have a successful hunt? Do they want to have a successful pregnancy? The fact of them recording what was important to them in their daily life, birth rates, a successful hunt. Also the idea of possibly this art being used for storytelling or entertainment purposes, that it simply wasn't serving a functional purpose, it was also serving an entertainment purpose, which is certainly linked to the way we view art today. And of course, a lot of this might have simply been personal expression, which I think also very much links up the art that we're seeing at this time period with the art as we know it today. So interesting to think of how it might be slightly different, but how much of it is still probably similar to the way we would conceptualize art in our current times. All right, that's all I have for this week. Thank you all very much for your hard work, and I will be back with our reflection video next time.